You're listening to the Mythcreant Podcast with your hosts, Oren Ashkenazi, Chris Winkle, and Bunny.
There was a castle by a waterfall with a pink and purple wall and a princess living there. She had no parents and was all alone. She got by on her own and she liked it pretty well. 'Cause she never wore socks. She had a pet snake. She bought a red guitar and she ate a whole cake. And there wasn't anybody there to tell her what to do, so she did what she wanted to. Everybody knew the story of the princess who saved herself.
Welcome to the Mythcreant Podcast. I'm Chris, and with me is
Bunny?
and
Oren.
Now, I know since this is the start of the episode, we're all feeling very optimistic, but what if in our hubris we go too far? One of us might choose poorly, and it will all lead to the downfall of the episode.
It's alright. I'm very confident that that's not a problem, so I'm not going to prepare for it. It'll probably be fine.
Nobody has ever been too arrogant before.
Yeah.
I was warned not to do this episode, but, it got nothing on me.
Don't trust the haters.
Obviously, everything's gonna be fine. What could go wrong?
I'm one day away from retirement.
Surely, if I made the choice to not properly edit my co-hosts' voices because I was feeling lazy that day and only edited mine, what could be the harm? Surely that wouldn't lead to anything bad.
Of course not. So now that we have done the summoning ritual for something that will definitely not harm us, let's get on to this topic, which is completely unrelated, of course, as it is every episode.
Yeah, that's how the opening bit works.
That's how the opening bit works. We're talking about downward turning points.
Oh, like a sharpened shepherd's crook? A scythe? Is it a downward turning point? Huh?
Yeah, that's right. Very appropriate, actually.
Yeah.
It's like one of those left turn signs, but it's kind of come unstuck. It's sort of on its side and it's just pointing at the ground.
Yeah.
Turn into the ground here, please.
I love how symbolic this is. Even though you're trying to say things that are unrelated, in your hubris.
We're too confident in our joke. We've accidentally made a serious thing, even though we were trying to be silly.
That's right.
It's terribly ironic.
I have a downward turning point that I'm very excited to share that I just saw the other night.
Oh, yes, we will do that. But first, we should probably remind people what a downward turning point is.
If we must.
In case there's somebody who doesn't know but still wants to listen to our podcast for some reason. Some trusting listener who is sure that we will define all of our terms.
There are dozens of us. Dozens.
Okay, so we talk a lot about how to make satisfying endings when you have a typical plot arc which is driven by tension. And the trick is that right at the climax you have something we call a turning point that determines success or failure. So whether the protagonist gets a happy or a sad ending. And most of the time we want happy endings. And so when we're talking about turning points, we almost always default to talking about that because the vast majority of books have standard or upward turning point. So the protagonist does something impressive or virtuous and it feels like they earned a reward and then they get a happy ending. Sometimes a bittersweet ending, but a lot of times they're mechanically the same. They sacrifice something, they're actually doing something impressive, and that creates kind of a bittersweet feeling. But in essence, they succeeded at what they were trying to do, even if it cost something.
Yeah.
But this time we are talking about how they earn comeuppance instead. So a character, not necessarily a protagonist, does something bad, and then they're punished, and then the audience gets their schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude.
Right. It feels right that this happened, because that's the trick to this, is that you both need to logically show that it makes sense that this happened. You also need to satisfy the reader that it feels correct that this happened. That's the trick. And if you don't do that, the readers are going to be mad.
Right. And just in case anybody is unfamiliar and is like, oh no, that seems too simplistic. Well, it's more complicated in practice, but this is how all the stories work. I swear this is not us trying to impose some moral simplicity on stories that is not already there. They all already work this way. Even like stories that are missing turning points are usually trying to mimic them, and it's just the storyteller doesn't quite know how they work and just doesn't quite get them precisely, but we can still see that they're trying in the way that they're constructed.
The most common kind that is trying to emulate a turning point but doesn't really work is when the character tries really hard and then tries harder and succeeds.
Yeah.
We need to know why it works this time.
Another common one is the Super Saiyan one, where they just feel feel so intensely because something bad is happening that they are powered up now. And you getting really mad is not a satisfying turning point.
So what is? It's more complicated than this in practice, but we can basically boil it down to 3 traits where we have either 3 virtues or their opposites, which would be our misdeeds that make us feel like somebody should be punished. And it's not always about, a lot of it is about ethics, but not necessarily. It's not perfectly condemning somebody. Sometimes it's just about, it only makes sense since you did that would fail.
Yeah.
Or succeed, for instance. It doesn't make logical sense otherwise. So the obvious ones on either side are selflessness and selfishness. Obviously, being selfish. Part of that is the hubris, and arrogance and lacking humility is kind of an extension of that, of being really into yourself and thinking you're above everything. Then there's, on one side, the determination, persistence, and the other side, I'm just going to call taking the easy route.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it kind of strongly correlates to what we consider to be weak will, but I don't like to use that term because studies have showed that's not actually a thing. Nobody has weaker will than anybody else. But in this case, if somebody gives into temptation or is lazy or gives up easily, that would all fall in the taking the easy route. It makes sense that if you keep trying, you are more likely to succeed. And if you push past the barriers, you are more likely to succeed. So there's kind of an obvious cause and effect here.
Yeah.
And then the last one, cleverness is considered a good thing that should be rewarded. And the opposite side is not being clever. Lack of cleverness is not something that characters are punished for. You have to be obviously careless.
Right. Making obviously bad choices.
So ignoring warnings, cutting corners, that kind of thing.
Imposing tariffs on your own economy, things like that.
Worse on penguins.
And the hubris thing also falls into the carelessness category, right? Not only is it self-aggrandizing, but there's also a certain amount of carelessness that comes with arrogance. So that's generally something that would be a misdeed. Some action based on that would be a misdeed that's worth punishing.
Yeah.
Generally in a story.
Okay, so now that we've got the basics, I've got a really interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
So, spoilers for Andor Season 2, Episode 8. And this is what happens with Cyril. Because Cyril has a little awkwardly kind of transitioned into having an arc where he's starting to question the Empire.
Right, and just for anybody who's not familiar with Andor, Cyril is he starts out in Season 1 as like a low-level corporate cop or something like that in the Empire.
Yeah.
And then he becomes kind of like an administrator, so he's on Team Evil.
Yeah. And so by this point, he is starting to realize that maybe he is the baddies, and that the Empire is not doing good things, and this is made very clear to him when he sees the Empire's soldiers open fire on a crowd of civilians. And he's like stumbling around this like scene of this massacre, trying to figure out what to do. And he is at a turning point, right? He's at a turning point where he could choose to turn against the Empire, and we would see that as a successful turning point, and he would deserve, something for that. I don't know if reward is the right word, because again, he's done a lot of bad things, but he would at lead recognize that the Empire was wrong and that he should do something about it. But instead, he sees Andor, the main character, who he has like an obsession with.
We had a big vendetta against.
And he gives in and decides to attack Andor instead of doing anything about this massacre that's happening. And so then he and Andor have like a fight, and it's, very gritty, and they roll around and punch each other a lot. And it ends with Cyril having a gun on Andor and then getting shot by another rebel. And like right after Andor like looks at him and says, "Who are you?" Which is like the greatest burn that anyone has ever unintentionally delivered.
Because in Cyril's mind, Andor is his like nemesis or something.
Yeah.
Right? So the shock of being like, so you've gone out of your way in the middle of this massacre to attack me personally. I don't even know who you are.
Yeah. It feels like under normal circumstances, if we didn't have the whole thing going on with Cyril, if Andor was just like in a fight with like a major bad guy, and then he won the fight because some random rebel showed up and helped him, it wouldn't really be very satisfying. It'd be like, oh, okay, good job, random rebel, thanks. But this wasn't about Andor. This was about Cyril, and Cyril dies because he made the wrong choice. And like, it's a very cool scene, and it works really well, and it's an example of how this is simple in concept, complex in practice.
Yeah, so basically the most iconic turning points are almost always used for villains. Because with heroes, we have to worry about whether they're likable or whether the audience will get frustrated. But we don't have to worry about that for villains. And so they're just free to make bad choices and then get punished for that. I think the most iconic ones I've seen are like Indiana Jones. The Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, they're seeking the Holy Grail and they come upon this old immortal knight at the end of all of their labyrinth that they have to get through. And Indiana Jones gets through, but also a villain gets through. And this knight has a whole bunch of grails. And so he challenges them, pick which one you think is the grail, and then drink from it and see what happens. And the villain chooses based on the advice of somebody who betrayed Indiana. One of the turning points that's common, the downward turning points, is the betrayed betrayer. Basically, if you have a situation where what goes around comes around, that's a kind of a typical downward turning point. So this villain hired somebody to betray the main character, and now he relies on her advice when choosing a grail and believes her when she's like, oh yeah, this one that's full of gold and jewels, it's totally the Holy Grail.
That's totally the one.
Right, which is where you get that meme format with that old guy being like, you chose poorly, as he drinks from it and ages really fast and dies.
Right. Continuing the weird Indiana Jones tradition of the bad guys would have failed even if Indiana Jones didn't do anything. Very strange. At least the two good Indiana Jones movies both have that. It's very odd.
But yeah, obviously Indiana Jones chooses the right one and drinks from the grail, and he's like, you chose wisely. It's just like that really iconic scene of good choice, poor choices. And that's basically what every turning point is, just subtler, usually.
Yeah, and we see that again, actually, a little later when they're trying to get out of the area and the magic of the place, or maybe God or whatever, is stopping them from leaving and bringing the whole place down because you're not supposed to take the grail out of there. Indy makes his battle of will turning point and is like, okay, I will leave the grail behind, whereas his hot lady friend, who is also evil, she can't do it, and she gives in to temptation to try to get the grail, and as a result falls to her death and dies.
Yeah. It's a little funny when you think about it, because on one hand, determination is usually a positive attribute.
Yeah.
In a different story, Elsa could just be determined and it would be good. But because this is framed as a temptation, also she is warned. That's another big sign that it's a downward turning point, as opposed to she's just real scrappy and she's going to get that grail, and good for her.
Yeah, you go, lady who was working with Nazis. Are you also a Nazi? Hard to say.
Hard to say.
Unclear. You're hot, though.
Right, but the fact that she's warned by this knight not to take the grail past the seal, right, and let it go, and refuses those warnings. There's definitely a lot of subjectivity, a lot of downward turning points, and oftentimes the more relatable ones, when you have like a sympathetic villain, are the refusal to let go of something. Which, if you look at it versus determination, one of the things that you'll see for determined characters is their ability and willingness to make sacrifices, including sacrificing their life or giving up something that they want, or making a choice that has some downsides that will put them in danger.
I wonder if we're supposed to view that particular turning point as greed. She won't give up trying to get the cup because she's greedy for it, maybe? I think that's how I read it.
I think that certainly factors into it. I feel like there's a certain indolence is sometimes what I've called this opposite of determination. If you're lazy, but you're also used to luxury and greedy, as opposed to scrappy and self-sacrificing. And
Right. We talk a lot about how traits that in some stories are positive traits that would make the character earn or deserve their victory, in other stories can be portrayed as negative and make them feel like they deserve their failure.
Which is why this isn't as simplistic as it may sound.
Right.
Is because what is determined, what is carelessness, for instance, or when we have Hamlet, for instance, where he uses caution, but it's too much caution to the point where it's carelessness.
Right. Ned Stark is our favorite example. Ned Stark is honorable and he is chivalrous, and in most stories that would be a good thing and we would want him to win, but we see that Westeros is such a cutthroat place that when he starts to ignore possible allies because that doesn't fit with his sense of honor, now it feels like you're just making bad choices, man.
Now you're being careless. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's how it is a lot of times with heroes, because we talked about that a lot of the most iconic ones happen with villains because you don't have to worry about certain constraints. But when you have heroes, readers, they can be unlikable because of what they do, but readers can also get really frustrated. So if you ever got mad after you saw a main character make was obviously a bad choice. You know what this is like.
Yeah, I have a whole post about that, how I needed my character to make a mistake, and my readers consistently did not like it.
There's no perfect solution that works in all cases, but you can have them take a good karmic trait a little too far, and that's exactly what happens with Ned, is one way to make it better.
Yeah.
Trying to make the choices understandable as you can, and just make it mild, and then give them an outsized punishment for how mild the mistake is.
Yeah.
So it's like, you were a little careless in that didn't lock the door, but you didn't know there would happen to be a bunch of people breaking in that night and killing people or something. Not locking the door is a relatively minor thing to be careless about, and it happened to be a bad night. That would be the kind of thing that is used with a protagonist typically.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about these in terms of the conclusion of a character's arc. Often that includes them dying, but downward turning points also can happen in lower stakes issues earlier in the story, right? Especially when you need your character to fail so that the tension stays high, so it actually feels like failure is possible.
Or it's part of their arc, like it's something they're overcoming, so we see them fail to overcome it a couple times.
Yes, that's exactly right. Here's the thing. Usually you don't actually need this for tension. And the reason why you don't need it for tension earlier in the story is because it actually looks just like a problem that starts an arc. So anytime you want something bad to happen or something to go wrong that raises tension, you can have the protagonist fail. And like Bunny said, storytellers typically choose that option when there's a character arc and there's something for them to learn. But if they actually don't have any agency and something just bad happens that raises tension, it just looks like a new arc has started. The villain just struck.
Yeah.
You don't want to deprive your protagonist of agency, period. You don't want everything to go wrong all the time and the protagonist not have anything to do with it. That's bad. But as long as the protagonist has some successes and has some agency, you can have a failure that they didn't really have agency in, because that just starts a new arc. It just looks like a different part of story structure.
There's an interesting comparison to be made in the Expanse books. Spoilers for those, I don't remember exactly which books this happens in. But there are two examples in the Expanse books of the villains ending a book by pulling off a major victory. And the first one is against this guy, Inaros. And Inaros isn't the perfect villain. He kind of comes out of nowhere, and it feels weird that we've never heard of him when he's apparently this super capable rebel commander. But he does manage to pull off a pretty convincing win at the end of one of the books when he slams an asteroid into Earth and takes control of the belt and is in a pretty strong position. And part of the way he's able to do that is that our Team Good, which is not just the main characters, are too busy squabbling with each other to properly unite against him. That really helps there. It feels like they have made mistakes, and that has opened the possibility for Inaros to win the day. Now, of course, it helps that this is clearly building to the next book where he's going to get defeated, but it still generally works pretty well.
Like The Empire Strikes Back, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, where Luke decides that he's going to leave training, and that leads to... He does succeed in some things as a result, but it also leads to a big failure. But because this is only the second in a trilogy, we can kind of like, okay, that failure is also kind of a hook for the next story.
Right. But then later on, we try this again with these guys who they go off and live on an alien planet for a little while, and then there's like a 30-year time jump, and then they show back up with a bunch of super tech and just completely steamroll over the solar system. And it's some of the most frustrating stuff I have ever read, and part of that is just because these guys feel really contrived. They're a totally super powerful mega tech faction was just forming off screen for 30 years. Don't worry about it. That definitely happened. But even if they had had a better explanation, there was just nothing the Team Good could do about this. So it felt dishonest to drag it out for so long.
Right.
Team Good does everything right. You know, they all unite, they all have the perfect strategy, they get all their ducks in the line, and it's not enough. And it's like, why did you make me read an entire book about that? You could have summed that up in a chapter.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely the thing, because this doesn't make for good conflict, right? You want your protagonist to have some agency in conflicts, too. So generally, when you start a new problem that opens an arc, it happens pretty fast. Karma is something that is created and then sticks around until it's paid off, right? That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Why it really matters if we're talking about the climax or an earlier sequence, because a character can do something good or bad, and as long as that is not balanced out, they're not rewarded or punished for that, that just sticks around on their tab, and we just expect it to be resolved at the end. But until then, until the very end, and if it's a series, it could be an entire series, the payback could come later. later. Generally, if it happens fast and they don't have any agency in it, then that's something to be, okay, they didn't do anything wrong, yet they still lost, but they're going to turn it around.
Yeah.
Because they didn't deserve to lose, so we're going to turn it around later. You could have some fight where the villain succeeds because they're better.
I think that would have been fine. It's just that it took an entire book.
Right, no, it just took too long.
That's the sort of thing you want early in the book, because then the idea is that you're struggling to recoup from that.
Yeah, again, recommend giving some people some satisfaction at the end of a book. Even if the story doesn't officially end till the end of the series, it sucks to get to the end of the book and get no satisfaction.
Cliffhanger, baby.
It's like a cliffhanger, but you're like swinging from the cliff, so you're hitting your head against the side of the cliff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A really weird one that this showed up, I swear, in every Redwall book would be that the hero would defeat the villain, and then the villain would beg for mercy, and the hero would say, okay, I'm granting you mercy because I'm not evil. And then the villain would try some sneaky, cowardly attack after they'd been granted mercy, and this would lead to them dying.
The self-disposing villain.
Yeah, it's the self-disposing villain.
When you want the villain to die, but you don't want the hero to kill anybody. That's right.
I swear every Redwall book ends that way, and it's so weird.
The superhero movies do that a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the attack that reflects back on them.
Yeah.
But the other way that we dispose of villains is with the betrayed betrayer or victim's victim.
Mhm.
What goes around comes around.
Yep, exactly. We have some person innocent that the villain hurt that we learned about earlier come, and one of my favorites is that at the end of Stardust, where we have three witches that kept a bunch of animals in cages because they were using the type of divination where you look at guts, and then the animals just as soon as they're let out, they know exactly who hurt them and just swarm them.
Get him.
But that's pretty typical, something like that.
Yeah.
Their minions that they were mean to once freed, carry them away, and we hear them screaming, but we don't have to watch anything happen.
One of my favorites is near the end of Deep Space Nine, and I don't love this arc in general. It feels kind of weird and anticlimactic, but there's a specific part in this, and this is when Gul Dukat, who is working with the Paw Wraiths, has decided he's going to go down to the cave where the Paw Wraiths are all imprisoned and let them out, and Sisko has to go to stop him. And Kai Wynn is also there and has sort of decided that she doesn't want to be on Dukat's team anymore. And there's this section where she could have just thrown the book into the big fire lake, the magic book that Dukat was using, because this is sci-fi, right? It's got a magic book. And she could have just done that and won, but instead she makes a big show of doing it, and then Dukat blasts her with a Paw Wraith laser. And at first I was like, this annoyed me. She could have just won right there. But then I thought about who Kai Wynn is, and I'm like, yeah, no, she would want credit as she was doing it. She would want Sisko to look at her and be like, Sisko, acknowledge me that I'm doing this good thing because I'm very special and I need affirmation.
Gul Dukat is just like that too.
Yeah, Dukat also is like that. So in retrospect, I actually like that. I think it was in character.
Forgiven.
An example I'd like to use of a protagonist downward turning point that is made mild is in Spider-Man No Way Home, where basically what we find out is that Peter Parker's girlfriend and best friend didn't get into the college they wanted to go to because he has a bad reputation.
Yeah.
And so first he goes to ask Doctor Strange to basically cast a spell to make people forget who he is to change that. And because he's doing it for his friends, initially it seems selfless. So that kind of softens it. But then we find out when Doctor Strange starts casting a spell and he's like, oh, well, you appealed the decision, right? And then he's like, no. Which shows carelessness, right? And a lack of dedication that he didn't do his due diligence. So that takes a point against him. And then during the spell, he keeps asking for more things. He's unwilling to make sacrifices. It doesn't show that he's properly determined. And then the spell goes wrong. And then he's like, okay, it's my fault. Now I have to make up for it. And he didn't really do anything super bad. We can understand why he was doing what he was doing. At the same time, we can also see how he wasn't careful and he overreached. And so it's understandable that he feels he has something to make up for.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I think we can go ahead and call this episode to a close. And we didn't have to pay for any of our arrogant choices earlier, so it's great. It all worked out.
Oh, no. No, it means the karma is still outstanding.
It's fine. Just assume that it happened after we stopped recording.
Please don't punish us by going to patreon.com/mythcreants.
That would be awful.
We would hate it so much. Before we go, I want to thank a couple of our existing patrons. First, there's Amon Jaber. He's an urban fantasy writer and a connoisseur of Marvel. And then there's Kathy Ferguson, who's a professor of political theory in Star Trek. We will talk to you next week.
There was a dragon with a pointy tail. He was bigger she tied him to a tree so the dragon couldn't fly. She told him he was mean and it made the dragon cry. When he finally apologized, she offered him some tea. He accepted it graciously. Now he visits every weekend with the princess who saved herself.
This has been the Mythcreant Podcast. Opening closing theme, The Princess Who Saved Herself by Jonathan Colton.